Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome back to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 56, and today we're looking at the walking, talking cross in the Gospel of Peter. In episode 55 of the NT Pod, we took a first look at the Gospel of Peter, a fascinating 2nd century apocryphal gospel. It's in the name of Peter the Apostle, but it clearly isn't actually written by him. That's a kind of authorial fiction. And there are all sorts of fascinating things in this text. Perhaps the most fascinating, no, I won't even say perhaps, certainly the most interesting, is the spectacle of the cross that Jesus has been crucified on, apparently following Jesus out of the tomb on the day of resurrection. Let's just remind ourselves of the scene. I'll read to you from the Gospel of Peter. Early in the morning, when Sabbath dawned, there came a crowd from Jerusalem and the country round about to see the sealed sepulchre. Now in the night in which the Lord's day dawned, when the soldiers were keeping guard, 2 by 2 in each watch, there was a loud voice in heaven, and they saw the heavens open, and 2 men come down from there in great brightness and draw near to the sepulchre. That stone which had been laid against the entrance to the sepulchre started of itself to roll and move sidewards, and the sepulchre was opened, and both young men entered. When those soldiers saw this, they awakened the centurion and the elders, for they also were there to mount guard. And while they were narrating what they had seen, they saw 3 men come out from the sepulchre, 2 of them supporting the other, and a cross following them, and the heads of the 2 reaching to heaven, but that of him who was being led reached beyond the heavens. And they heard a voice out of the heavens crying, "Have you preached to those who sleep?" And from the cross there was heard the answer, "Yes." It seems quite a bizarre thing to have to read out. In fact, reading it out loud, I'm almost inclined to do a funny voice when we get to the cross's answer, yes, because how does a cross talk? How, for that matter, does a cross walk? It's really difficult to imagine the scene. The description of this, the resurrection of Jesus, simply descends into what looks to us like a piece of farce. The whole scene is something that delights scholars of early Christianity because it gives them a story that they can tell in their classes about non-canonical gospels, or that they can share with their students when they're trying to explain what a story of the resurrected Jesus actually might look like. But it's always really bothered me. There's something that's never felt quite right about it. And over the last year or so, just in my idle moments, I've been wondering a little bit about this text and wondering about if there's another way that one might be able to read it. And what I'd like to suggest is that there is a possible different way of looking at this text, and I'll try and explain why I think this is the case. As a bit of background, the first thing is that we have to establish that this is a really absurd tale. The idea of a walking, talking cross following Jesus out of the tomb, it's difficult to believe that people would have taken that kind of thing seriously. Walking, talking crosses are simply not everyday items, and this isn't an everyday kind of narrative. But it's not just that. It's also that there's a certain lack of clarity in the narrative. It's really quite difficult to get at what's supposed to be happening. So, for example, you have 3 men emerging from the tomb. All these 3 men become giants. They extend to the heavens. Jesus' head extends beyond the heavens, and the other 2 men extend to the heaven. But the cross is apparently still on earth. And then God appears to address this cross from heaven in spite of the fact that the cross is still down here on earth. And the wording is quite strange because you hear that a word was heard coming from the cross, as if they can't see the cross actually talking. Mind you, how on earth do you see a cross talking? Does it have a mouth? I mean, it's difficult to know anyway what's going on there. But the narrative is kind of incoherent. It's very difficult to picture. Furthermore, there's no precedent for it in the text. The Gospel of Peter does tell the story of Jesus' crucifixion. It tells the story of Jesus' burial. And One of the things it does talk about is Jesus' removal from the cross. There's no sense that the cross has been buried with Jesus. If you're going to build up to this bizarre conclusion where the cross emerges from the tomb, surely you prepare for that by speaking about the cross being buried with Jesus in the earlier point in the narrative. Just to illustrate the point, it is said that the stone is rolled over the entrance of the tomb so that later on we can talk about the stone rolling away from the entrance of the tomb. Well, I've got a possible solution to this, and it's something that is called in textual criticism a conjectural emendation. It's something where one actually looks at the Greek text and says, has the scribe made some sort of rather strange error here or mistranscribed something key? And could we try and imagine what his own exemplar actually said? And here, my suggestion is that the text from which the scribe is working, or the text from which that scribe was working, didn't say the cross emerged from the tomb, but instead said the crucified one emerged from the tomb. The crucified one, i.e. Jesus. That would mean then that it isn't this strange scene of three men emerging from the tomb followed by the cross. Rather, the three men emerging from the tomb, the two that originally entered into it, and the third one, Jesus, who's described as the crucified one. It would solve all of those problems in an instant. But you might say, well, hold on a minute, Mark. How can that be the case? And you might point out that it's a pretty big mistake for the scribe to have made. Well, I don't think so, because one of the things that happens in these ancient texts is you get these things called nomina sacra, which are kind of sacred abbreviations. People abbreviate the name God and abbreviate the name Jesus and abbreviate things like the crucified one. And we have another text that does the same thing, that abbreviates this term crucified one. In Greek it's staurothenta, and it's the same first three letters as the word for cross, stauros. What I think happened is we had one of these nomina sacra in the text, and it said star. It said just those three letters, S-T-A, if you like, in transliterated letters. And the scribe has misconstrued them. He hasn't realized that they are the crucified one, and instead he's seen them as the cross. He's just read it naturally as being the cross. So he's misconstrued what he's seen in the text. He's if you like, he's unraveled an abbreviation incorrectly and ended up with this rather bizarre, unusual kind of text. Now, if my conjecture is right, this is how the text now sounds. And while they were narrating what they had seen, they saw three men come out from the sepulchre, two of them raising up the one, and the crucified one following them, and the heads of the two reaching to heaven, but that of him who was being led out by the hand by them reaching beyond the heavens. And they heard a voice out of the heavens crying, "Have you preached to those who sleep?" And from the crucified one was heard the answer, "Yes." It's a greatly improved text. It makes much more sense of what's there. You now have three characters emerging from the tomb and not four. You have the two and the one the text talks about. And it's worth pointing out also that this rare word, staurothenta, the crucified one, actually does occur later in the Gospel of Peter anyway, in verse 56, so we know that it's in the author's vocabulary. No doubt some people will object to this by pointing out quite rightly that you can't just go around conjecturally amending every text, and conjectural emendations shouldn't be proposed lightly. I think that's a good point, but one of the things you have to point out here is this is our only textual witness to the text. It's hundreds and hundreds of years removed from the original author's text, and if you look at this text, it is replete with errors and riddles and bizarre things. If you look at the page that this is on, we can't even tell what's being said at certain points. So the idea of a minor error in relation to the incorrect working out of a certain nomina sacra, a sacred abbreviation, isn't really at all a stretch. Others might object that it's unlikely that a scribe would misread one of these nomina sacra. After all, it is something that texts are familiar with, that scribes are familiar with in antiquity. But the point is that the text is completely inconsistent in the way that it uses these nomina sacra. Sometimes it unravels them, sometimes it doesn't. Moreover, nomina sacra involving the word stauros, cross, are very common, whereas those involving staurothenta, the crucified one, are pretty rare, so it would be a very easy mistake to make. And at the same time, the text never uses the term Jesus, never refers to Jesus as Jesus in the text. So here he's being called the crucified one, just as he's called the crucified one a bit later on in verse 56. It's entirely to be expected. It's not at all unlikely that this is what the scribe has done. And I think the advantages of my reading, my suggestion, do outweigh any of the possible negatives. Probably more important than anything else is the fact that in my reading, Jesus is not upstaged at his own resurrection by his cross. You don't end up with the cross having the key speaking role when Jesus has just raised from the dead. This is utterly bizarre and completely unprecedented. At the same time, think of what the cross is supposed to have done here. God says, "Have you been preaching to those who are asleep?" And the cross says yes. Well, this refers to what's known as the harrowing of hell. The idea that after Jesus' crucifixion, he goes to hell and preaches to the souls that are lost there. And this is something that's always associated with Jesus in early Christianity, including, most prominently, in another text that's attributed to Peter, 1 Peter 3:19. How plausible is it really that this text, the Gospel of Peter, would be contradicting the most famous example of the harrowing of hell in which Jesus himself goes to hell and preaches to those souls that are bound up? No, what's happening, I think, is that Jesus has been crucified, buried, he goes to hell, preaches to the souls that are there, and now he is raised and exalted to heaven, where he addresses God along with those other two people who have come down from heaven and also now are returning. Well, that's my little suggestion anyway for how to unravel one of the great mysteries of the Gospel of Peter. And one of the things I think you have to say on occasions like this is, I could be wrong. It's just a conjecture. I don't have textual evidence for this, but the textual evidence is very slight anyway for the normal reading. We've just got this one late text. So I think one, might be allowed a little conjecture in cases like this. And who knows, maybe one day someone will dig up a bit of the Gospel of Peter and it might say what I think it originally said. Well, anyway, thanks for listening to the latest episode of the NT Pod. It's good to be back and it's good to have your company, and I hope there'll be some more regular episodes along again soon now that my life is a little less busy than it has been over the last 2 or 3 months. You can find me on the web at podacre.blogspot.com, on iTunes U, go to the Facebook NT Pod page or follow me on Twitter. It's great to have your company. Look forward to being with you again soon. Thanks a lot for listening and goodbye.